Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the very edge of the roof of the world, a place where the air is so thin you can feel your pulse thudding in your ears, and the sky hangs so low it feels like you could run your fingers along its blue underbelly. You might think, wow, that sounds peaceful. But let me be real with you, if you're not prepared for this altitude, you might not even survive your first day. This is not the kind of place you wander into holding a frappuccino. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're in and what time it is right now. I like to imagine each reply as a little campfire glowing somewhere out there in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A to C and a 6 roof on Newson shows. You step onto cracked yellow earth. Each step sends a puff of dust curling away in the wind. The air feels sharper here, the kind of dry cold that pinches your cheeks. In the distance, shapes rise from the barren ground, jagged pillars and ridges stacked like some enormous, forgotten sculpture. Geologists will tell you this is the Zander Earth Forest, formed over millions of years as ancient lakes dried up and their sediments were carved by wind and rain. But standing here, it feels less like geology and more like stepping into a dream, or maybe a memory the earth has been keeping for far too long. Following the glint of the Sutlej River, you notice how it slices through the dusty plateau like a silver thread. A local might lean in and tell you a curious fact. This river was once the lifeline of the Guge Kingdom. People believed its source was the home of a god, and even the yaks, yes, the very same yaks that climb cliffs without fear, would not tread too close. The ruins come into view slowly, as if the land is reluctant to give them up. The walls climb the hillside in layers, forming what once was a vertical city. Centuries ago, this was Saparang, the beating heart of the Guge Kingdom. At its peak, it stood at the very crossroads of faith and trade. Monks debated scripture in dimly lit chambers, while caravans from India, Nepal, and Central Asia rattled through its gates. Yet, no matter how solid stone feels under your hand, history has a way of reminding you that nothing lasts forever. In the 17th century, one particular winter night, Guge seemed to vanish. Not a gradual decline, but a sudden absence, like a candle snuffed out in a silent room. Historians still argue about the cause. Was it a political betrayal, a religious purge, or the slow, invisible tightening of outside forces? Whatever it was, it left behind weathered walls, silent passageways, and questions that refused to be answered. You wander further in, boots crunching against gravel that once might have been the polished floors of a palace. You trail your fingers along a faded mural. The pigments, reds, golds, and lapis blues are muted now, but the face of the Buddha still gazes back at you with a calm that feels timeless. Somewhere in the wind, you think you hear whispers. Maybe it's the voice of the past, or maybe it's just the plateau reminding you that you're a guest here, walking through a place that has outlived kings, armies, and empires. And this is where our story begins. The wind carries you further along the Sutlej River. It's the kind of sound that seems to stay the same no matter how many centuries pass, a low, steady hum that could lull you to sleep if it weren't for the sheer vastness of the landscape. The river glimmers under the sun like a ribbon of steel, winding between cliffs the color of pale gold. But before Guge, before the palaces and Buddhist murals, this land had another name, Zhangzhung. Imagine a kingdom so old that when the Tibetans first started writing down their history, Zhangzhung was already an echo in their stories. The people here followed Burn, an ancient religion woven from threads of nature worship, ancestor veneration, and shamanistic ritual. It's older than Tibetan Buddhism, and like all old traditions, it's stubborn. It never really disappeared, even when later religions tried to paint over it. You pass a cave cut into the hillside. Its walls are marked with strange, swirling symbols. A local elder, leaning on his wooden staff, tells you a curious detail. The kings of Zhangzhung once kept a special herd of snow-white mountain goats. The wool from these goats was used to weave ceremonial robes for priests, and these garments were believed to protect the wearer from evil spirits. You can almost picture one soft as clouds, shimmering faintly in the dim light of a temple. In the 7th century, the rising Tibetan Empire swept into this region. Zhang was absorbed and its political independence ended. Bonin's influence began to wane, replaced by Buddhism brought in from India. Yet, like an underground stream, the old faith continued to flow beneath the surface. Monks debated doctrine in public halls, but in mountain valleys and private homes, bone rituals were still quietly performed. Centuries later, the Great Tibetan Empire fractured and the plateau dissolved into smaller, competing states. Out of this chaos came a man named Guge Kingdom. A prince from the once powerful central Tibetan dynasty, he fled west after losing in the brutal power struggles of the time. Around the 10th century, he arrived here, this barren, beautiful land along the Sutlej. And here, he built a new kingdom, Guge. Historians still debate why he chose this spot. Some say it was for its natural defenses, cliffs that made the city nearly impossible to siege. Others argue it was for spiritual reasons, a desire to place his capital where the old traditions of Zhang and the newer Buddhist teachings could meet and merge. Whatever the reason, his choice shaped centuries of history. You climb a slope and the ruins seem to grow taller around you. It's not hard to imagine how Tsaparang might have looked in those early years, whitewashed walls gleaming in the sunlight, prayer flags fluttering in the wind, the air filled with the scent of juniper smoke. From the highest terrace, you could see not just the winding river, but the snow peaks beyond, silent and unmoving, as if watching over the new kingdom. And somewhere in that wind, you might hear the echo of a promise, a vow from a king who believed he could carve a future here at the edge of the world. The first decades of Guge felt like a new dawn. The kingdom grew out of the raw stone and dust of the plateau, its walls climbing the cliffs in tiered layers like a giant staircase toward the sky. Life here was not easy at this altitude. The air was thin, the winters long, and the soil stingy with its gifts, but the people adapted. They learned to coax barley from narrow terraces, to herd sheep and goats across the rocky slopes, and to store every drop of the precious river water. Guge Kingdom's vision went beyond survival. He wanted Guge to be more than just another fortress state. He embraced Buddhism, inviting scholars and artisans from Kashmir and the Indian plains to bring their texts, their techniques, and their ideas. Slowly, the kingdom became a beacon of learning and art in this high, harsh world. Inside Tsaparang's temples, flickering butter lamps lit the faces of monks chanting in deep, resonant voices. The walls were covered in murals so intricate that you could lose yourself tracing the folds of a deity's robe. Some of the pigments came from so far away, like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, that they traveled farther than most people would in their entire lives. Here's a quirky detail you might enjoy. Court records mention that Guge kings sometimes held debate contests between visiting scholars, with the winner rewarded not with gold, but with a finely bred horse or a length of the kingdom's best wool. Apparently, nothing says academic honor like a sturdy riding companion. But as much as Guge was a spiritual center, it was also a political player. Its location was strategic, close to the trade routes linking India, Nepal, and Central Asia. Caravans carried salt, wool, tea, and turquoise through its gates, and with them came news, rumors, and the occasional spy. Guge's kings had to navigate this delicate web of alliances and rivalries with both skill and caution. And even within its own borders, unity was not as perfect as the whitewashed walls suggested. The blending of old burn traditions with imported Buddhist practices was not seamless. In villages, some families clung to the old ways, quietly performing rituals that predated the kingdom itself. In the monasteries, debates flared: was the king's embrace of Buddhism a sincere act of faith or a political move to align Guge with the great centers of Buddhist learning? Historians still argue about this, and perhaps they always will. Standing on one of the terraces today, you can almost see it, the city alive with movement, traders unloading their goods, monks hurrying between prayer halls, children chasing each other through narrow lanes. The air smells faintly of smoke and barley beer. Somewhere in the palace, the king listens to an envoy's report from far off Nepal, weighing whether to send gifts, troops, or simply words. For now, Guge stands bright against the sky, a jewel on the plateau, but in its very success, the seeds of its future troubles are already sown. Power invites envy, and faith, when too closely tied to politics, can divide as easily as it unites. and as the wind curls around the old walls, you can almost hear it whisper, "Nothing gold can stay." The plateau feels eternal, but even here, change rides on the wind. In the early 17th century, Guge's high white walls began to see travelers unlike any they had welcomed before, men with pale skin, strange clothes, and an even stranger language. They had crossed the Himalayas not for trade, but for faith. These were the Jesuit missionaries from Portugal, part of a global wave of Catholic outreach. They arrived with crosses around their necks and books under their arms, their Latin prayers carried into the thin mountain air. And yes, they also brought gifts. Glass beads that caught the sunlight, metal tools sharper than anything forged in Guge, and according to one local account, a small mechanical clock that became the talk of the palace for weeks. The king at the time, known for his curiosity, welcomed them. Guge had long been open to ideas from afar. Buddhism itself had once been a foreign import, so perhaps he saw no harm in hearing what these visitors had to say. The missionaries learned Tibetan, sketched maps, and translated religious texts, creating a bridge between worlds that, on the surface, seemed entirely different. Here's a detail that still makes historians smile. One missionary reportedly carved a sundial in the palace courtyard to show the passage of hours. The locals, used to measuring time by the sun's position and the rhythm of daily chores, were amused but unconvinced. As one monk is said to have remarked, "Why trap time in metal when it's already free in the sky?" For a while, the cultural exchange felt almost like a friendship. The missionaries painted images of Christian saints, their European style blending oddly but beautifully with Tibetan colors and motifs. They studied the land and its people, while the Guge court listened to tales of distant cities where the sea stretched farther than the eye could see. But friendship is a delicate thing, especially when belief is involved. The missionaries came not just to share, but to convert. Their message that there was only one true path to salvation clashed with the deeply rooted Buddhist traditions of Guge, and while the king may have been open-minded, not all his subjects felt the same. Monks debated fiercely in temple halls. Was this a dangerous distraction or a genuine new layer to the kingdom's spiritual life? Historians still argue about how much influence these Western visitors truly had. Some say they were little more than a curiosity at court, their faith unable to take root in the rocky soil of the plateau. Others believe they set off a chain of events subtle at first that would later contribute to Guge's downfall. Walking among the ruins now, you might imagine the scene. A missionary in a heavy wool cloak, shivering slightly in the cold, gesturing toward a painted crucifix as a monk tilts his head, trying to follow the unfamiliar story. Somewhere nearby, a scribe dips his pen in ink, recording the meeting for future generations. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the faint echo of two worlds speaking across a chasm of faith, neither quite able to understand the other, but both too fascinated to walk away. At first glance, Saparang still seemed unshakable. Its whitewashed walls caught the sun like polished bone, and the terraces were busy with live traders haggling, children playing, monks carrying baskets of firewood. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The arrival of the Jesuits had set off quiet ripples in the court. The king's willingness to host them, to listen to their ideas, even to allow small Christian chapels to be built, this did not sit well with everyone. In the monasteries, senior lamas exchanged uneasy glances. Religion here was not just a matter of faith, it was the backbone of political authority. To allow another belief system, especially one so assertive, was to invite competition where unity had been the key to survival. And unity was already fragile. Factions within the court began to form. Some advisors, impressed by the missionaries' knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and distant politics, urged the king to deepen the alliance. Others whispered that the Jesuits were spies in disguise, here to weaken Guge from within. One curious detail from a surviving palace record mentions a debate that lasted 3 full days. The topic? Whether the king should be allowed to wear a small silver crucifix gifted by one of the missionaries during public ceremonies. Supporters argued it was merely a token of friendship. Opponents claimed it sent the message that the king's spiritual loyalty was divided. The final decision? The crucifix stayed but was worn discreetly beneath layers of silk robes. Historians still argue about whether these tensions were exaggerated in later accounts. Was this truly the beginning of Guge's political unraveling, or just another chapter in its long history of balancing multiple influences? We may never know for certain, but the mood at the time was undeniably shifting. Beyond the palace, villagers and traders had their own opinions. Some were curious about the strange visitors and their foreign god, others saw them as omens of trouble. In a land where every storm cloud could mean a ruined harvest, omens mattered. It wasn't just religion that was causing friction. Trade with neighboring regions had begun to change too. The Jesuits introduced new goods and ideas, but they also brought new competition. Local artisans worried that foreign-made items would undercut their work. Monks grumbled that too much time was being spent discussing foreign sciences instead of scripture. And then there was the matter of loyalty. The powerful monasteries of neighboring regions were watching closely. If Guge drifted too far from the Buddhist fold, alliances could fracture, and the kingdom's already precarious position between larger powers would become even more dangerous. Standing in the ruins now, you can almost picture the council hall lamplight flickering against carved wooden beams, the air thick with incense and tension. One advisor leans forward, voice low and urgent. Another taps his fingers on the arm of his chair, measuring the room before speaking. Outside, the wind slides along the cliffside, indifferent to the decisions being made inside. From the outside, Guge still looks strong, but in its heart, the first cracks were spreading small enough to ignore if you wanted to, but deep enough to matter if you were paying attention. The thing about living on a windswept plateau is that life teaches you to be patient. You wait for the snow to melt, for the barley to grow, for the caravan to arrive. But patience has its limits, and in Guge, by the mid-17th century, those limits were being tested. Religion, once the unifying thread of the kingdom, had begun to pull in different directions. The king's patronage of Buddhist monasteries was still strong, but the arrival of the Jesuits had altered the conversation. Suddenly, there were competing narratives about the nature of the divine, and more importantly, about who should have the ear of the ruler. The monasteries had long enjoyed significant influence over the court. Monks advised on political matters, blessed military campaigns, and mediated disputes. Their authority was not just spiritual, it was practical. But now, the presence of foreign priests, who spoke of a single God and salvation through Christ, created a subtle rivalry. The monks called it a shadow across the Sunday. The Jesuits, for their part, saw it as an opportunity for dialogue or perhaps for quiet persuasion. One unusual record from this period describes a heated discussion in the main assembly hall. A missionary, speaking in careful Tibetan, presented a painted scroll depicting the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The artistry was fine, but the symbolism was foreign. A senior monk responded by unrolling a thanka of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, pointing out the 1,000 hands and eyes as a sign of limitless mercy. The comparison wasn't just theological, it was political theatre, each side showing the court why their vision of compassion should guide the kingdom. Outside the palace, these debates trickled down into daily life. In the markets, traders argued about whether the king's interest in foreign ideas would bring prosperity or invite ruin. Farmers wondered if the weather was turning harsher because the gods or God were displeased. In a land where spirituality and survival were entwined, the boundaries between faith and politics blurred quickly. And it wasn't just about religion. The Jesuits introduced new techniques for irrigation, metalwork, and even medicine. Some innovations were embraced, especially in the villages that benefited directly. Others were met with suspicion. A blacksmith in one valley famously refused to use European steel, claiming it smelled wrong when struck with a hammer. Whether he meant it literally or figuratively, no one knows. Historians still debate whether the king's acceptance of these influences was driven by genuine curiosity or a strategic attempt to modernize his kingdom. Either way, his decisions created winners and losers, and the losers began to organize. Powerful lamas, regional governors, and certain noble families started to form quiet alliances, united less by shared ideology than by shared frustration with the king's openness to foreign influence. From the vantage point of Saparang's highest terrace, the danger was invisible. You would see the same golden light spilling across the cliffs at sunset, the same prayer flags snapping in the wind. But in the council chambers below, lines were being drawn. The tension came to a head during an annual religious festival. Normally a time of unity, monks chanting, pilgrims offering butter lamps, nobles exchanging greetings, this year's gathering was marked by visible division. Some processions carried Buddhist banners, others Christian crosses, and a few deliberately avoided either, choosing only the symbols of Guge's royal house. That evening, the king gave a speech calling for harmony between beliefs, but the applause was thin and uneven. In the shadows behind the torchlight, whispers carried. Was the king losing his grip? Could Guge remain both a Buddhist stronghold and a friend to the West? Or was it destined to fracture under the weight of two competing faiths? You stand now among the ruins, the wind tugging at your coat, and you can almost imagine the sound of that night, a mix of drums, conch shells, and low voices murmuring in corners. The air is cold, but the memory feels warm with the heat of unspoken conflict. And somewhere in that silence, you feel it. The first moment when the kingdom's walls, though still standing, began to tremble from within. The throne room of Saparang had always been a place of ceremony, grand processions, golden lamps, and the steady murmur of courtiers exchanging formal greetings. But on this winter evening, the air was different. The guards at the great doors shifted uneasily, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Inside, the king sat alone at the far end of the hall, listening to a voice that did not belong to any of his official advisors. The man was dressed in plain wool, the kind worn by shepherds in the valleys, but his eyes sharp, restless, betrayed that he was no ordinary traveller. He claimed to have come from the borderlands, where caravans whispered of an army gathering beyond the western mountains. Their banners, he said, were painted with both the sun and the sword. This was the first time the king had heard the name spoken in the throne room, Ladakh, a neighbour in geography, but in politics, a predator. The shepherd, if he was one, spoke with urgency. The Ladakhi king had heard of Guge's openness to foreigners, of its supposed weakness in letting foreign priests wander freely within its walls. To some, it was a sign of enlightenment, to others, an invitation. The king listened, his fingers tracing the armrest carved with the lotus and lion emblem of his dynasty. Meanwhile, in the upper galleries of the palace, two figures watched the scene from behind a tapestry. One was Dronma, the king's half-sister and a formidable strategist in her own right. The other was Lobsang Tsering, a high-ranking lama whose influence in the monasteries rivaled that of any noble. They had been allies once, but tonight they shared only a single goal: to steer the king away from what they saw as a dangerous path. What happened next is still a point of debate among historians. Some say Dronma stepped forward that very night, confronting her brother in the open court. Others believe she moved more subtly, sending word to the Ladakhis in secret, inviting their intervention under the guise of restoring the kingdom's purity. The truth may lie somewhere in between, lost to the smoke of politics. One thing is certain, the tension in Saparang became a living thing. The Jesuits, now a small but visible presence, noticed the change. Father Francisco, the most senior among them, wrote in his journal about a heaviness in the air, as if the mountains themselves held their breath. There was still beauty in the city, the snowfields glinting under the moon, the prayer flag snapping in the wind. But beneath it ran a new current rumours of spies in the palace, of monks refusing to chant in certain ceremonies, of soldiers training at night in the dry riverbeds. Then came the omen. During a temple ceremony, the great butter lamp that had burned for 3 generations sputtered and went out. The monks claimed the wick had simply reached its end, but in a land where symbolism was stronger than steel, no one took it lightly. That night, a quiet message passed through the palace: prepare for change. And standing now in the empty shell of that throne room, you can almost hear it still, the whisper that started it all, curling like smoke under the high ceiling, impossible to catch, impossible to ignore. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, each one catching the faint torchlight from Taparang's high walls. At first, it was just another winter evening on the plateau, silent, cold, predictable. Then the sound came. At first, you might mistake it for wind thudding against the cliffs. But no, the rhythm was too measured, too human. Drums, distant, muffled by the snow, but growing. It was a patrol of Guge's scouts who brought the news. Their boots were caked with ice, their breaths ragged from the climb. They had been shadowing the northern passes for weeks, watching for any sign of Ladakhi movement. That night, they returned not with a sighting, but with certainty. An army was on the move. Fires in the distance, steel glinting in the moonlight, tracks in the snow where no trader should be traveling this season. The city responded in layers. The palace guards tightened their watch, halberds now held with both hands. Messengers slipped through back alleys, delivering sealed letters whose wax bore no official mark. In the markets, news spread faster than the cold half-truth, half-invention. "They have war elephants," one baker whispered to another. "They carry cannons from the Mughal lands," a shepherd claimed. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Inside the palace, the king convened his council. The great hall glowed with the flicker of butter lamps, shadows dancing across the murals of Guge's victories past. Advisors stood in tight clusters, their breath visible in the unheated chamber. Dronma was there, her eyes catching the lamplight, unreadable. She spoke first. "If the Ladakhis breach the outer walls, we will not withstand a siege. The stores will not last." Lobsang Tsering, the High Lama, countered with calm precision. "If we surrender our faith to foreign influences, the kingdom is already lost, siege or no siege. Perhaps this army comes not to destroy us, but to restore what we were meant to be." That last sentence hung in the air. The implication was not subtle. Father Francisco, standing at the edge of the chamber in his thick wool cloak, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if these men come with steel, you will need more than prayers. You will need strategy. Let us help you fortify. We have knowledge of walls, of defenses." He stopped when he saw the looks aimed at him. Not just suspicion, something colder. Historians still argue over the next part. Some claim Droma quietly left the chamber that night to send a coded message to a Ladakhi envoy waiting beyond the passes. Others believe she spent the hours rallying loyal captains to prepare for a defense that would defy the odds. The written records are vague, as if even the scribes feared putting the truth to paper. Meanwhile, the streets of Taparang shifted into a strange half-life. Blacksmiths worked by torchlight, pounding out arrowheads and spear tips. Farmers abandoned their fields to carry stones up to the walls. The smell of pine resin from hastily built barricades mixed with the usual incense drifting from the temples. And still, the drums came closer. From the northern gate tower, you could see them now, tiny figures at first, moving like a slow, deliberate shadow across the snow. The Ladakhi army travelled with discipline, no scattered lines, no wasted movement. Fires burned in neat rows at their camps. Banners snapped in the icy wind, each painted with a rising sun split by a blade. That night, the king walked alone along the battlements. The cold gnawed at his fingers even through fur-lined gloves. Below him, the city huddled under the dark, its alleys whispering with unspoken fears. He thought of the times Guge had been strong, when its influence reached far beyond these valleys. He thought of the old treaties, the friendships now frayed to threads. And he thought of the choice before him. Fight, knowing the odds. Yield, and perhaps see Guge survive in name, but not in spirit. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound echoed off the cliffs, mingling with the low, steady beat of the enemy drums. In the monastery atop the eastern ridge, monks chanted through the night, their voices weaving through the thin air. But even there, in that sacred place, some voices carried less conviction than others. Faith, like stone, can crack under enough pressure. By dawn, scouts reported the Ladakhi vanguard had reached the lower passes. Snow powdered their armor, their weapons were sheathed, for now. But their drums, those drums never stopped. And standing here now, in the ruins where those walls once stood, you can almost hear them still. A slow, relentless beat that says only one thing: we are coming. At sunrise, the snow glittered like scattered salt. And for a heartbeat, Saparang looked peaceful again. White walls, prayer flags frozen mid-flutter, the river a dull ribbon of steel. Then the horn sounded from the northern pass, long hollow calls that made the stone underfoot seem to hum. The Ladakhi vanguard had arrived. Inside the city, the courtyards burst into motion. Armor was lifted from pegs, leather thongs pulled tight, yak hair ropes coiled over shoulders. A captain named Tendar ran the length of the lower rampart, tapping spear halves with his gloved knuckles, speaking low to each cluster of men. Hold here, breathe through your nose, save your arrows. Don't chase glory, chase the line. He said it like a prayer he had repeated in every winter of his life. Down in the market quarter, a curious, practical bustle kept pace with the fear. Women in thick wool smocks ladled clarified butter into clay bowls, fuel for the lamps in the tunnels and for the fire pans at the arrow slits. A boy carried bricks of salt to the stores. In this corner of the world, salt still passed for money, heavy and honest in the hand. A monk with blue-stained fingers hurried past, cradling a packet of malachite pigment as if it were gold. For the banners, he panted. Colour makes courage. On the high terrace, the king met with his council beneath beams, blackened by years of smoke. Dronma stood beside the window arch, watching the valley without blinking. Lobsang Tsering folded his hands within his sleeves, face serene, voice careful. Father Francisco remained a pace behind the others, respectful, alert, his wool cloak dusted with frost. On a low table lay a map, the city terraces like stacked teeth, the switchback path, the crumbling outer wall the masons had begged to rebuild last autumn. Signal towers, Dronma said, tracing the ridgeline. If they cut these, we lose sight of the valley. We must hold the eastern spur. We must hold the Dharma, Lobsang Tsering answered softly. If the city survives but forgets its heart, what have we kept? Francisco stepped closer, palm hovering above the map but not touching it, an outsider's courtesy. Your walls are steep. Force them into the bends. If you can buy the first day, you can buy 3. If you can buy 3, you can make other plans. Other plans, Dronma echoed, eyes flicking to the king. In that quick glance sat everything unspoken. Evacuation routes, hidden caches, the old rumour that a tunnel from the palace led down toward the river cliff. By mid-morning, the ladder-he lines crested the last rise, tidy columns uncoiling into ranks. Their banners showed a rising sun bisected by a blade. No elephants, despite the market whispers, but neat ranks of archers, compact shields, long-limbed spearmen with furred caps pulled to their brows. They did not rush. They unrolled, measured, and took the field like men setting a careful table. The first exchange was almost polite. A ladder advanced, a volley answered, a ladder fell. Conch shells boomed from the temple roofs, and Saparang's defenders shifted as one body, rolling stones to the lip, lighting braziers, waiting. When the wind turned, the bells in the monastery courtyards began to ring, not from human hands, but because the air had grown taut enough to pluck bronze. A curious detail flickered to life along the wall walks. Strings of small flags, not prayer flags, but signal strips, the old yak hair semaphore that predated the city's current ramparts. A 3-flag flutter meant water up. A short, long short meant arrows low. It looked like ornament until you knew the code. Then it became a whispering nervous system stretched across the stone. At noon, the drums hit a steadier cadence. Ladakhi sappers moved to the switchback, shields overlapped, bodies low to the snow. Tendar watched their feet rather than their faces, careful boots. Step count perfect. Not raiders, he muttered. Engineers. He set a hand on the pulley of a counterweight gate, felt the cold iron bite his glove. Hold. From the monastery on the east spur, the chanting deepened. The king climbed the final stair to the rooftop and stood beside a line of butter lamps that burned with the steady, practical flame of this country. Dronma reached into her sleeve and, without looking, handed him a strip of silk, old, faded, the royal colours. When the dyes were mixed differently, he tied it at his wrist. The gesture was too small to be ceremonial, too honest to be merely private. History, in its broad strokes, says much the same thing. That in the 17th century, Ladakh pressed Guge hard, and that Saparang, this city of terraces and tunnels, faced a siege that tested everything it believed kept it whole. What the chronicles cannot agree on are the human hinges, who decided what, when, and why. Near the third bend in the switchback, a Ladakhi squad reached the blind corner, where the rock bulged and the wall thinned. Tendar lifted his hand. Torches swung. From the slit above, pitch spilled black as a shadow and hissed where it met snow. Stones tumbled after, a rough, avalanche kind of logic. The first line broke. Not rooted, disciplined men rarely rout but rippled, and in that ripple, Guge took its first clear breath of the day. From the palace stair, Francisco saw it and made the sign of the cross under his cloak, the motion hidden, the gratitude not. He turned as Lobsang Sering stepped close enough to share breath in the cold. "Your God," the Lama murmured, "listens quickly." Francisco smiled, weary. Sometimes. Today, perhaps. Other days, he is quiet. "Then we are alike," the Lama said, eyes returning to the valley. By late afternoon, the air grew meaner needles of ice, wind with teeth. The Ladakhi lines withdrew a measure, not far, just enough to reform, to confer. In the brief lull, runners darted along the inner parapets, carrying bundles, slings of flint, coils of rope, small clay pots stoppered with wax. Dronma found Tendar at the counterscarp, his beard rimed white, the skin around his eyes raw from the cold. "Two things," she said. "You'll get one of them. Choose." "Say both," he answered. "Save the northern gate," she said, "or buy us 6 hours." She did not explain what 6 hours would buy. Tendar nodded once. "6, he said. She looked at him, then at the men behind him, boys with grandparents' knives, veterans with the scars to map old winters. "When the bell rings 3 times, she said, "you'll know what 6 means." Below the city, the Ladakhis lit torches that burned blue at their lips. The sappers brought up bundles wrapped in oilskin. No cannons, this was not the plains, but packages heavy enough to strain 2 men's backs. They placed them at the base of the wall where the stone had weathered and withdrew in tidy lines. Tendar watched, head tilted. "Not fire," he muttered. "Sound." The first blast was not a blast, exactly. It was a shove in the bones, a dull thump that made the snow jump and the teeth in your head sing. The wall did not crack, but the men on it swayed as if a hand had pushed them. The second followed, then a third, and the old mortar coughed dust. Far off, a dog began to bark and would not stop. In the palace, the king gripped the rail until his knuckles went bloodless. Lobsang Sering's lips moved, silent now, the prayer gone inward. Francisco stared at the cliff as if he could will it to remain a mountain. And then the bell rang 3 deep, measured notes from the temple on the ridge. Droma darted down a side stair, past a door barred since the reign of a king whose name had fallen out of use. 2 guards looked at her, then beyond her, then away. She slid the bar, the door side open, the smell of old air and river silt rising like a memory. The tunnel. Not a myth. A vein cut through the hill, walls glazed by the touch of 1,000 hands that had never admitted they were there. Lamps flared as wicks caught. The light climbed the curve of the passage like dawn around a bend in the world. 6 hours, Dronmar whispered to herself. No more. Above, Tendar raised his hand again. "Stones," he called. Then silence. Then listen. He felt the wall under his palm as if it were an animal he might soothe. The next shove came, he bent with it, bent his men with him, kept them soft where stone was brittle. When the wind dropped, he heard it. Not drums now, but voices on the snow. A cadence of men counting measure, place. "Engineers," he said again, as if naming them would undo them. "Let's make them artists of regret." Historians still debate whether, in those hours, a message passed from Chaparang's upper chambers to the Ladakhi commander promise, a bargain, a warning. Some claim a lantern placed in a certain window signaled surrender at dawn. Others insist no such light burned and that what happened next was decided in the old, blunt language of stone and will. Night fell. The wind rose. Down in the hidden vein of the city, the lamps kept their small, steady moons. Up on the wall, Tendar listened to snow hiss against his hood and counted heartbeats like beads on an unseen string. When the 4th shove came, something in the cliff groaned low, tired, ancient. Men looked at one another, not in panic, but in knowledge. 6 hours, Tendar murmured, and lifted his hand for the final time. The wind came in waves that night, each gust rattling shutters and shaking the prayer flags until they snapped like whips. From the wall, Saparang looked less like a fortress and more like a lantern balanced on a cliff. Edge, small, stubborn, casting its glow into a darkness that did not care. The Ladakhi campfires burned in neat rows beyond the pass, a field of ember stars beneath the swollen moon. Inside the city, the air had changed. It wasn't just fear, it was decision. People moved differently when they believed the hour was truly upon them. In the palace kitchens, cooks ladled the last of the winter butter into tall copper jars. Some would feed the soldiers, others would be poured down the walls if the enemy climbed. In the stables, grooms rubbed down the few remaining war horses with pine resin, their hands moving quickly, voices low. In the cloisters, monks whispered mantras not for enlightenment, but for endurance. Historians still argue about the atmosphere of that night. Was it one of resignation or of quiet resolve? The surviving Ladakhi accounts describe a city that sang to itself under the moon, as if reminding its own heart to keep beating. The Guge Chronicles, written decades later, are more guarded. That night, the air was close and the walls were like ears listening for a verdict. In the council chamber, the king sat alone. The butter lamp sputtered in the draught, throwing his shadow high onto the mural of Avalokiteshvara behind him. He had dismissed his advisors hours ago, unable to stomach the layered council fight, surrender, stall, bargain. Now, only the sound of his own breathing remained, and the low, steady hum of the wind. Then the door opened, and Dronma stepped inside. She did not bow. She set a small wooden box on the table, its lid carved with the old royal seal, a mountain under a crescent moon. "There is no time for words, Majesty," she said. "Inside is a seal the Ladakhis will accept as proof of your terms. If you give it to me tonight, I will walk out through the lower tunnel before dawn and end this siege without more blood." The king looked at her as if trying to see through her skin. "And in exchange?" "In exchange," she said, "Guge will live, not as it is perhaps, but alive." Before he could answer, the door opened again. Lobsang Sering entered, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the box, then at Dronma. "Alive in name is still dead in truth," he said quietly. "If the Ladakhis enter as masters, they will decide our prayers, our books, our children's tongues." Father Francisco arrived moments later, drawn by some unspoken current. He stood in the doorway, his eyes moving from one face to another. "Majesty," he said, "there are moments when all choices are wrong. Then the question becomes, which wrong will you carry more easily to your grave?" The king closed his eyes. Outside, a bell rang once, deep and slow, the signal from the eastern spur. Tendar's men had held through the night so far. But how long could they hold against an enemy that measured its moves like a jeweler weighing silver? In another part of the city, the tunnel was alive with preparation. Women wrapped infants in thick wool, pressing bread into small cloth bags. Old men checked the oil in their lamps, knowing they might not walk fast enough to see the other end. The tunnel's air was cool, damp with the scent of stone and the river far below. Tendar himself had been summoned to the palace before midnight. He arrived with frost in his beard, his armor dented from the day's shoves against the wall. 6 hours, he reminded Dronma when their eyes met. She nodded. "You gave them to me. I will spend them." Back at the northern gate, a quiet signal passed among the Ladakhi, ranks 3 short drum beats, then a pause. Sappers moved again, but not toward the same wall section. This time, they split their force, approaching 2 points at once. It was the kind of move that forced a defender to choose, and quickly. Tendar's second in command, a boy named Norbu, barely old enough to shave, looked to him for orders. "The gate or the wall, Captain?" "Both," Tendar said grimly. "We bleed for both." And bleed they did not in the bloody sense of the word you might be imagining, but in the slow draining of strength, of warmth, of will. Every torch held aloft burned butter that would not be eaten. Every stone rolled from the parapet was one fewer for the next day. The city's lifeblood was not red, it was time, and they were losing it. Meanwhile, in the palace chamber, the king finally spoke. "Give me the box," he said to Dronma. "If Guge survives, history will judge me. If it falls, it will not matter what I chose." Lobsang Tsering's mouth tightened, but he did not speak again. Father Francisco stepped back into the shadows, as if to make himself small enough to escape the weight of the choice. Dronma took the box, tucked it inside her cloak, and left without another word. Outside, she crossed the courtyard, the snow crunching under her boots. The wind lifted the edge of her hood, revealing eyes that caught the torchlight but gave away nothing. She descended toward the tunnel entrance, the lamps inside flickering to life one by one as she approached. Above, the battle still murmured shouts muted by snow, the thud of something heavy meeting stone, the answering scrape of wood on wood. The Ladakhi drums shifted tempo, a quicker heartbeat now, as if sensing that the city's own pulse was faltering. Later, much later, some would swear they saw a lone figure walking out across the frozen river under the moon, not running, not hiding walking, as if the night itself were her escort. Others would insist no such figure left the city, and that whatever bargain ended, the siege was struck by other hands entirely. The truth remains buried with the walls, and in the wind that sweeps the ruins today, you can almost hear two voices, one urging surrender, the other whispering defiance, each convinced they were the one who loved Guge more. The first light of dawn did not so much rise as seep thin and pale, like water through cloth. Snow crystals caught the glow, but it was a tired light, the kind that told you this day would not bring warmth. From the eastern spur, Tendar saw the sky's bruise turn faintly gold. It was enough to see the Ladakhi lines shifting, tightening. They were coming, not in a rush, but with the deliberate pace of men who knew they had the advantage. The horns began again, 3 long notes, echoing off the cliff faces until they seemed to come from all directions at once. Down below, the switchback path looked alive, a black thread weaving upward, studded with the glint of spear points. Inside the palace, the king stood at the window, his fingers wrapped around the sill, as if the stone could keep him from being swept away. Behind him, Lobsang Sering moved through the room, lighting the last of the butter lamps, one after another, their flames swaying in the draught. "Majesty," the Lama said softly, "the eastern wall will not hold much longer." The king didn't turn. "I know." In the tunnel, Dronma was already halfway to the hidden exit. She carried the wooden box close against her ribs, feeling the steady thump of her own heartbeat against its lid. The passage smelled of damp earth and lamp oil, and each footstep stirred dust that had been undisturbed for decades. Behind her, families moved in silence, children clutching bread, elders holding the hands of the young. Meanwhile, on the wall, Tendar's men braced for the next shove. It came not from a siege engine, but from ladders 3 at once, driven into the snowbank below the parapet. The first wave of Ladakhi soldiers climbed with frightening speed, their boots digging into the rungs, shields slung over their backs. Tendar met them at the lip. The clash was close enough to see the frost in the enemy's beards, to hear the grunt of breath with each swing. The defenders fought not for ground, but for moments, seconds, to tip a ladder back into the void, to reset, to grab the next stone. In the palace courtyard, a runner arrived breathless, his voice breaking, "The gate! They've split their force again, north and east!" Francisco heard it from where he stood in the gallery. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer in Spanish that no one else understood. "Señor, si no es tus de voluntad salvarnos, al menos danos un final digno." Lord, if it is not your will to save us, at least give us a worthy end. The king gave his answer without hesitation. Pull from the market quarter to reinforce the gate. The walls can be rebuilt, the gate cannot fall. But the walls did not wait for orders. On the east spur, a section gave way with the slow, heartsick sound of old stone surrendering. Snow and rubble poured down the slope, carrying 2 ladders and the men on them. The gap was not wide, but it was enough. Ladakhi horns blared. The enemy surged toward the breach. Tendar shouted for oil. His men rolled clay jars toward the gap, smashing them against the stones. Flames rose, sharp and bitter, the smoke curling into the cold air. It was not enough to stop them, only to slow their steps, to buy the minutes that might matter somewhere else in the city. Back in the tunnel, Dronma reached the hidden exit, a narrow cleft in the rock that opened onto the frozen river. The wind hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. Across the ice, barely visible in the pale dawn, a small party waited 3 riders, their horses stamping in the snow. She hesitated only once, glancing back toward the city. From here, Tsaparang looked like a painted toy, too small, too perfect to hold all the noise and desperation within its walls. Then she stepped out onto the ice, the box still against her ribs. On the wall, Tendar caught sight of movement in the valley. He knew that silhouette. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Some truths you carry alone. At the breach, the defenders locked shields, leaning into one another, their boots skidding on the frost. The Ladakhi spears probed for gaps, the line buckling, straightening, buckling again. And then, through the cold and smoke, came the sound of the great bell from the monastery, the signal for retreat. It tolled 3 times, each note heavier than the last. Somewhere behind him, a voice shouted, "Orders, Captain?" Tendar looked once toward the city's heart, where the bell still trembled in its frame, then toward the breach, where his men stood shoulder to shoulder. He knew what 6 hours had brought. He knew they were spent. "Fall back," he said. "Make them fight for every step." The sound of fighting inside Tsaparang was wrong. Battles outside the walls had a rhythm, drums, shouts, the clean clash of steel in the open air. But once the Ladakhis poured through the eastern breach, the noise changed. It became an echoing chaos, every blow magnified in the narrow lanes, every scream trapped between stone walls. It was like hearing your own heartbeat in your ears during a fever too close, too loud, impossible to escape. The market quarter was the first to break, stalls overturned, baskets of dried apricots scattered into the snow, a cart of wool caught fire, the smoke curling low over the rooftops. The defenders fought from doorways, hurling whatever they could, stones, jars of grain, even the iron spits from their hearths. Tendar pulled his men back street by street, setting up choke points. But for every Ladakhi they dropped, 2 more appeared. The enemy moved like water, flowing around obstacles, finding every weakness. In the palace, the king stood before the throne but did not sit. Lobsang Sering was beside him, prayer beads coiled in his hands, lips moving in silent chant. The great hall was tense guards shifting their grips on spears, servants frozen in place as if stillness might make them invisible. Then the northern gates slammed open. Dronma entered not from the tunnel but through the palace doors, flanked by 2 strangers in heavy Ladakhi cloaks. Her hood was back, her face calm. In her arms, the wooden box was gone. The king's voice was low, but it carried. "Where have you been?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes travelled across the room, resting for a heartbeat on Francisco, who stood in the shadows. Then she looked back at the king. "I went to save the kingdom." "You went to sell it." Tendar's voice rang from the hall's edge. He was bloodied, his armor dented, but he had made it back from the wall. "I saw you on the river. The enemy did not break us. You opened the gate for them." Lobsang Sering stepped forward. "Enough. If she has bargained for our lives, it is not for us to condemn her now." Francisco's tone was quiet but sharp. "And if the price is the soul of Guge?" Outside, the fighting pressed closer. The great bell tolled again, not the retreat signal this time, but the flat, relentless peal that meant the enemy was at the palace steps. A captain burst into the hall, breathless. They're inside the outer court. The king's gaze flicked to Dronma, then to Tendar. "Hold them as long as you can," he said to the captain. To Tendar, "If the throne falls, get the children to the tunnel." It was then that the first Ladakhi soldiers appeared in the doorway, 3 of them, armor dusted with frost, swords wet with melted snow. They did not speak, they simply advanced. Tendar drew his sword. The first clash rang through the hall, the steel-on-steel echo bouncing off the painted walls. More enemy soldiers spilled in, forcing the king's guard into a tightening circle. Somewhere to the left, Francisco grabbed a fallen spear and planted himself in front of the steps to the altar. "Not one more step," he muttered in a language they didn't know. In the crush, Dronma vanished. Later, some would swear she left through a side door with the Ladakhi envoys. Others claim she died in the melee, her body lost in the chaos. The hall filled with smoke from burning oil, the murals blurred, Avalokiteshvara's many arms flickering in the shifting light until they seemed to move, to reach. The king still stood, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the great doors as if expecting someone or something else to arrive. When the doors finally burst wide, it was not rescue that entered, It was the full weight of an empire's end. The outer court was gone. Not in the sense that it no longer existed, but in the way a shell is gone after it's cracked, the shape still there, but hollowed, emptied of its strength. The snow inside was churned into mud by boots, streaked with black from the fires that now licked the palace eaves. Tendar's unit had fallen back to the inner gate, the final barrier before the throne hall. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp tang of resin. Someone had poured the last of the pine oil onto the wooden beams above the arch, setting them ablaze in a desperate attempt to make the gate impassable. It only half worked. Ladakhi rams slammed into the charred wood, each impact shaking the ground. Inside, the defenders braced shoulder to shoulder, their boots slipping on melted snow. Tendar could hear the breathing of the man to his right, ragged, fast, like a bellows being worked too hard. He didn't look. In moments like these, you couldn't afford to see anyone as a person. They were walls, they were stone. From the gallery above, Lobsang Tsering leaned over the railing, shouting mantras into the smoke. His voice was steady, but his eyes were searching the shadows for something. For someone. The king stood at the far end of the hall, not on the throne, but at the great carved window that faced the valley. The dawn had fully broken now, and the sky was an indifferent blue. Somewhere downriver, Dronma's bargain, if it existed, was either in motion or already betrayed. Francisco came to stand beside the king. "You can still leave," he said. "The tunnel is open. I'll see to it." The king's gaze did not shift from the valley. If Guge is to die, it will die with its king here. The next impact on the gate was louder, closer to splintering. Tendar shouted for crossbows. Bolts rained down through the smoke, but the Ladakhi shields were ready. Then came the crack, not the sharp break of a beam snapping, but the slow, groaning tear of wood giving way. Light leaked through the fracture, pale and cold. "Archers, now!" Tendar's voice carried over the roar. The gap widened. A spear point pushed through, then another. The defenders surged forward to meet it, the clash deafening in the confined space. Above the noise, the great bell tolled again. Not retreat, not alarm, just one slow, deep note, the kind that seems to sink into your bones. The gate gave way. The Ladakhis poured in not as a wild mob, but in tight formation, shields high, spears thrusting. The defenders were driven back step by step until the fight spilled fully into the hall. Murals blurred in the smoke, the painted deities watched impassively as men fought and fell beneath them. Lobsang Tsering descended from the gallery, moving into the swirl of combat without a weapon. He walked straight toward the Ladakhi commander, chanting louder now, his voice carrying even over the steel. Some say the enemy hesitated, that the sight of the old lama stepping forward unarmed paused the advance for a heartbeat. It wasn't enough. Tendar found himself shoulder to shoulder with Francisco at the foot of the throne dais. The Spaniard's spear was nicked and blackened at the tip, but he still set it against the floor, bracing for the next rush. The king finally turned from the window. His voice was low, but it cut through the chaos. "Hold them as long as you can." Those words were the last order ever given by King of Guge. The hall had no edges anymore, only smoke and movement, shadow and flame. What had been a throne room was now a shifting maze of bodies. The carved pillars were blackened, the gold leaf on the murals blistered and curling. Avalokiteshvara's painted gaze was lost in soot. Tendar no longer counted the enemies. He moved because stopping meant dying. His sword was heavy, his arm numb, but each swing still brought a heartbeat more for the men beside him. Francisco was still there too, though his spear had long since splintered. He wielded the broken haft like a staff, striking low to knock men from their footing. The king remained at the base of the dais steps, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his breath. His crown was gone, his hands hung at his sides, empty. The smoke curled around him like a second robe. When the Ladakhi commander finally pushed through the press, the hall seemed to pause. The commander was tall, his armor plain but polished, his eyes fixed on the king. He didn't raise his sword right away. He just looked, as if measuring the man before him. Lobsang Tsering stepped between them, palm out. His chant had softened, the syllables stretching. "This place has seen enough blood," he said, not in Ladakhi, but in the language of the high monasteries, one scholar to another. For a moment, the commander hesitated. Then his gaze shifted to the rear doors, where his men were dragging the palace banners into the open, their poles snapping. The king exhaled, long and slow. "It is done," he said. The fighting did not stop all at once. It ebbed, like water draining from a basin, pockets of struggle collapsing under the weight of numbers. The defenders fell back to the dais, then to the walls, then were simply gone, pulled into the tide of the captured. Francisco leaned on the broken staff, chest heaving. Tendar touched his shoulder, not a gesture of comfort, but of acknowledgement. They had held as long as they could. Outside, the horns blew again, not the call to advance, but the signal of possession. Saparang was taken. The Ladakis did not cheer. They moved through the city methodically, securing gates, dousing fires that threatened the grain stores. Somewhere in the maze of streets, Drunma was seen again riding at the edge of a Ladaki column, her face unreadable. Whether she had saved anything or anyone was a question only she could answer. By midday, the smoke had thinned. The air was clearer, but the silence was heavier. In the empty throne room, the sunlight fell across the cracked tiles. A single butter lamp still burned before the altar, its flame trembling. In the mountains beyond, the river kept flowing. It had no memory of walls or kings, of bargains struck or broken. To the river, the day was just another day. And for the first time in centuries, Guge was quiet. By the time the sun slid behind the western ridges, Saparang was nothing more than a silhouette, its jagged lines cut against the fading sky. The fires had burned themselves out. Only thin streams of smoke rose from the rooftops, drifting into the high, cold air. In the ruins of the throne hall, the king's body was gone. Some said the Ladakis took it for burial with honours. Others whispered that Lobsang Tsering's monks had spirited it away through the same tunnel Drunma once walked. A few believed he still lived, hidden in a remote monastery, watching the years fold over the memory of his reign. Francisco was last seen on the eastern road, walking alone, the haft of his broken spear strapped to his back. Whether he was heading home or simply away, no one knew. Tendar stayed behind until night fell. He moved through the empty courtyards, touching the stone walls as if memorizing them with his hands. In the quiet, he thought he could hear faint sounds, laughter from market days, the clink of metal in the forges, the low murmur of evening prayers. Memory is a stubborn thing. It lingers where it is no longer welcome. At the far edge of the city, he found a single banner still standing, its fabric scorched but intact. The emblem of Guge Sun over mountain was faded, but in the moonlight it seemed to catch a last glimmer of gold. He didn't take it down. Some things were better left to the wind. As for Drunma, the stories multiplied. Some swore she became an advisor in the Ladaki court. Others claimed she vanished into the deserts to the west, carrying the wooden box to a place no map could mark. And in certain telling, she never left Saparang at all, only stepped into the shadows between its stones, waiting for the day the city might breathe again. The people who survived scattered some to distant valleys, some to monasteries, some to the Great Plains, far beyond the mountains. But all of them carried the same question: how does a kingdom die? Is it taken from the outside or hollowed from within? The historians still argue. Some point to the clash of faiths, others to court intrigue or the slow erosion of loyalty. A few speak of Western influence, how a single foreign missionary could shift the weight of an entire throne. The truth is not a single thread, but a knot no one has yet untangled. Centuries later, the wind still moves through the ruins. It hums in the empty windows, slides over the crumbled walls. To those who stand there at dusk, it sounds almost like voices too faint to understand, but insistent, like a story trying to be told again. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not why Guge fell, but why it still speaks. Now the night has deepened. The mountains are dark silhouettes, the river below a strip of silver in the moonlight. You pull the blanket higher, the edges of the story still warm in your thoughts. Somewhere between waking and sleep, you wonder if the stones remember everything or if they, too, dream. Good night, my friend.